Hi everyone, this is John from Tulip. In this video, I'm going to show you how to incorporate a simple feedback step into your applications. So collecting feedback from end users is super important. It's a way of figuring out whether or not what you've built actually works for the people who need to use applications. It's a way of making sure the decisions you've made actually align with what end users are doing. And it's a way to make sure that you're incorporating continuous improvement and iterative improvement into your application workflows. All right, so really quickly before we move into building, let me just show you how this application works. So the way this feedback step works is I simply select whether or not I'm happy with this step or with this application. So I could click the smiley face if I'm happy, and I would click complete. And then that information is then stored, like my selection there was stored in this table where I simply have the name of the application and two fields for liked or did not like app. And I could do this again, and we can see that I completed this time, added another one there, and down the line we could just keep adding this. So you'd imagine this is the kind of step that would come at the very end of an application just before it completes. So right now, let's get started and go through how to actually build this ourselves. All right, so before we move on and start building, let's break down what's actually happening in this feedback step. So the first thing that happens is this feedback step either creates or loads a table record where you store that feedback. So we're just simply using the application information, the name of the application, to either find a table record by that application name or to create a table record with that application name. It's going to make it really easy to reference that table record that we're going to store in for like our feedback totals to later on. So first things first, we're just going to create that table and the table record structure to work with. Okay, so the next thing we do is we just add and embed two images to our application, a smiley face or whichever one you want for positive feedback and one for negative, and then we'll add triggers to each of those. So it's really important that we're actually embedding images here because that's going to allow us to add triggers to them, and it'll make this whole thing work. Without those triggers, we couldn't actually do this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a trigger that will update a Boolean variable corresponding to your plus or minus choice, to your approval or disapproval. So say we click on the happy face, it'll update the Boolean to true, and we'll be able to reference that later to actually properly increment the columns in our table. So then finally, upon completion, when we click the complete button, this application, the app looks at the value stored in that Boolean and then increments the positive or negative columns in the feedback table. So actually pretty simple. We're really just updating a variable and then based on the value of that variable, incrementing a number in the column. So without further ado, let's just build this thing. All right, so I'm here in the application editor, and first things first, we want to actually build the table that we're going to use to store our feedback counts for every individual application. So I'm not actually going to build a table in this tutorial, but I can show you the table that I'm using so you can create it yourself. Okay. So the table structure is actually super simple. So every single row is going to correspond to an application, and the two columns right here are simply number data type columns that take, on the one hand, how many times an end user has liked an application, and on the other, how many times they did not like the application. So really simply, it's just the application, number of times liked, number of times did not liked. You can easily see how you would expand this and add maybe a text field over here that you could store notes in, all sorts of things you could do to make this more robust and to have more information. But for right now, let's keep it simple. Now that we've created a table for storing our application feedback, the next things that we're going to do are create a table record placeholder that will allow our application to communicate with that table, and then we're going to create a trigger that will either load or create an entry in that table as soon as we open this step. So first things first, let's create the record placeholder. So if this is something you're not familiar with how to do in Tulip or how we approach the communication between applications and tables, I encourage you to check out the tables section in the Tulip Essential Certification course. That'll show you everything you need about tables. I've included a link below, but for now, let's just go through and do this really quick. So the first thing I'll do is I will select which table we want to communicate with. So that will be the list of applications. I will create a record placeholder, and I'm just going to call this create or load the feedback record. Great, so I'll add that right there, and this is all we need now. So we only need to load one record at a time. We only need to communicate with one table, so that's sufficient for creating our record placeholder. Now I'm going to come over here to the triggers. So on step enter, I'm going to add a trigger that create or load the record. So no conditions, no values we need to check, no ambiguity here. We're just going to create an action really quickly. So when the step is open, we'll do table record because the action is going to involve manipulating table records. So we're going to create or load our record. And we want this record to take the name of this application, right? So every single entry in that table is going to correspond with the name of an application. So we don't want to bother writing that by hand and needing to make sure that all of this stuff aligns. That's why we're creating the table, because we can do it with the app metadata that Tulip is using already. So what we'll do is we'll create a load a record by app info, app name. Now we're going to need to say which record we're going to load it into. So create or load the feedback record. So that's all we need for this trigger. Super simple. We'll hit save right here. And from now on, we'll get into building the rest of this application and the actual UI elements. Okay, so in this next step, we're going to add these triggers to these images. I've already taken the opportunity to build out half of it because you don't really need to see me do both. If you see me do one, you can get the idea. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to do two things. We're going to add this image in and add a trigger to it, and we're going to add a invisible asset behind it that's going to change color just to correspond with our decision. It's just a nice little design element. Adds a little bit of interest, makes it more interactive. But let's get going from there. Okay, so what I'll do first is I want to embed an image. When you use the embed menu up here and embed an image from there rather than using an asset, it allows you to add a trigger to it. So this is the preferable choice for right now, where we'd like something to do something dynamically within the application. So I'll just pick frowning face there. Great, I can just make that a little bit larger. So it's about the same size. I'm not going to work on making it totally pretty, even though this is a design video as part of a design course. You know, there are more important things. Okay, so then assets, we'll just do rectangle. Side this in. Great. So then what we're going to do here is actually set the fill to white right here first, just so it's blank. But what we're going to want to do is actually set this to a variable real quick. That'll allow us to dynamically update that later. So we'll just call this unsatisfied. Create unsatisfied. The default value can just be white, and the color is color. So then we'll be able to fill that later. We'll move it back right here. So similar, there should be another asset right there. We can do the exact same thing. We'll create a variable called satisfied, set the default value to white, and this will allow us to update it later, move it backwards. Great. Okay, so that's all we need to do with just like adding the simple buttons to this application. From here, let's actually start adding the logic to this application. So if we recall, what we're actually doing in this application is we're using these buttons right here to update a Boolean variable. So if we click the smiley face, we'll update yes into that Boolean. If we click the frowny face, we'll update no into that Boolean. And depending on what value is stored in that Boolean, we're going to increment the totals in our table. Okay, so first things first, then what we're going to need to do is just create that variable that will allow us to increment things. So we will call this feedback Boolean. So this we do want to save for analysis. We can take these colors off and we don't have to bother saving these for analysis. This is important because if you're using completion data rather than tables, this will allow you to actually align responses with an operator and follow up for that crucial subjective or discursive feedback. And we'll make sure that this feedback Boolean is actually a Boolean. We'll keep the default value blank right there because we don't want anything in there otherwise. Great, so now we can just go in here and start adding logic to this. So remember, so we come down here to the click action. When we embed images, we'll have that option. Let's go into this trigger right here. So we can call this increment satisfied column by 1. So one button is pressed. So if the variable feedback Boolean is blank. So we want to make it sure that you can't overwrite your decision, that you can only select one. Maybe you would want the operator to have the opportunity to click one and then change their mind and click the other, but for now we can just keep this check on it. Then what we'll do is we'll store. Yes, we'll change the value of that Boolean to positive. So we'll store a static value Boolean to yes, true, whatever your favorite Boolean is, to feedback Boolean. And then we will update the color. So that's the other trick right here. We will also do a data manipulation store static value color. We'll make that green to the location satisfied. Great. And so then we would just repeat this on the other side. So I can do that really quickly. So custom trigger, the increment not satisfied by 1. So same check. So we'll look at the variable feedback Boolean. It's blank. Add new action. So first thing we'll do is we'll set that Boolean to no or false. Static value Boolean no to location feedback Boolean, and then we will update the color really quickly. Data mode and store static value. Colors are under static value. Good to remember there, as are Booleans. Make it red to unsatisfied. Save. Great. So that's basically the extent of what we're going to do with this trigger. So in the next step, we're going to do the final thing, which is just add the logic to the complete button to make sure that all of this information is getting pushed into our table. All right, so the final thing we need to do is just add that complete button that will increment the counts in our table. So really quickly, I'll go up to the button menu, click on the complete button, drag that into place over here. And then from there, we just need to add logic to this complete button. So I'll go down here to the triggers area, click on pencil, and let's add some logic. So what we need to do is we need to just do a simple check. So when the button is pressed, if that variable is true, do one thing. If it's false, do another. And by that variable, I mean our add feedback to table variable that's recording our button press for the happy face or the sad face. So real quick, so if variable feedback Boolean is true, then we'll add a new action, and we will data manipulation, increment value, table record, feedback for app, liked app by static value 1. So all this is saying that is if the feedback Boolean variable is true, then add 1 to that table record or column that allows us to communicate that we'd like the app. And then we will do another if-then clause that is basically the inverse of this. So if variable feedback Boolean is false, then data manipulation, decrement value, that would be table record, feedback for app, and then we'll do the did not like app column by static value number 1. And then because we want to end the app, we'll just add a transition here. So we will application complete. Oops, nope, we don't want to complete and then log out. We would just like to complete the application. Great. So from here, all that's left to do is test this. Okay, so all that's left to do now is just to test this application. And normally I would advocate using developer mode for testing applications, but because I want you to see how this table is going to update in real time as I interact with the application, I'm going to do this in the player for now. All right, so first things first, I'll just click begin, and we should see this table load beautifully. Okay, great, that's doing exactly what it's supposed to. So the step is open, and our trigger to create that table record in this table worked exactly as it was supposed to. So now the trick is just to make sure that these buttons are working as they're supposed to. So I'll click the happy face first. Great, we're incrementing in the appropriate column by 1. So 1 time is by luck, 2 times is an application that works. So great, so we're seeing that it's incrementing appropriately. Now let's click on the smiley face, or the frowny face rather. Click complete, and okay, so we found our first mistake. I accidentally wrote this trigger to decrement, which I'm sure you caught if you were watching me do this. I was sort of on autopilot instead of increment. So I was incrementing or decrementing for a column that was negative instead of the opposite. I don't even know if it's the opposite, but let's just switch that out really quickly. I'll go into this complete button, change this decrement value to increment value. All right, save. And now that that trigger is saved, we should bring ourselves back to 0 in our table right here. Great. So this application is doing exactly what it's supposed to. So now we're at 1. Great. So this is a super simple feedback step. Really quickly, let me just recap exactly what we did in this application. So first things first, we created a table record, and then we created a step level trigger that upon entering created or loaded a table record. I'll name this create for load a record. Don't be like me. You should always name your triggers. So first things first, we created or loaded that trigger. Next, we embedded images into this application and attached triggers to each of those images that updated a Boolean variable, true for the smiley face, false for the frowny face. And then depending on the inputs or the value that was stored in that variable, we incremented or decremented from this column, or from the liked or did not like columns in our list of applications table. So that's it. That's exactly what you need to start creating basic yes or no feedback. From here, you can start adding all sorts of things with like sort of text-based feedback steps, net promoter score. There's a lot more you could do to start gathering subjective or discursive information, but this will give you a really good overview of whether or not your operators appreciate your applications. So thank you for following along. I hope this was helpful, and have a great rest of the day.